Hello everyone, and welcome to the 22nd rip-off episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Raul Menendez from Call of Duty Black Ops 2. Perhaps the most famous Call of Duty antagonist, second only to Vladimir Makarov, Raul Menendez also comes off as the most morally complex, a league above Nikita Dragovich in my opinion, who I touched on previously. I've even seen a video that plays devil's advocate for him. But in the video I'm highlighting, I think the creator of the video downplays the extremist methods of Raul Menendez. And while Raul is absolutely a well-intentioned extremist, it's still important to note that he's still an extremist. While affable from time to time, tragic and sympathetic, it's still worth noting that Menendez's methods make him a villain. But he has more cause to think of himself as a hero than his predecessor Dragovich. I don't even think Dragovich saw himself as a hero. He was just a psychopath with the Soviet Union's military on his side. Raul Menendez has persevered as an iconic antagonist of the Call of Duty franchise, and to this day, albeit in a limited capacity, people still talk about him, because Black Ops 2, despite being like an action film, encourages you to think about things through its branching and changing storyline, where the ending is ultimately decided by the player. When I first played Black Ops 2's campaign, I got a really bad ending, where I executed Raul Menendez, thus making him a martyr for his cause, Cordis Die. Now how I'm going to approach this video is simple. The varying outcomes in relation to Raul Menendez will be considered, canon to the Black Ops timeline or not. I think the non-canon outcomes still provide insight into how Raul's character reacts to different situations. And the only inconsistent thing we have to talk about is whether or not he killed Admiral Briggs. As far as I can tell, the canon fate of Briggs is not clear, but given Raul's character is consistent aside from that, I will take into account both choices. Without further ado, let's begin. Raul Menendez was born on September 5th, 1963 in Nicaragua, Central America. Raul Menendez, as other characters and himself discuss, grew up in the environment of the Cold War. He was around during the country's revolution and is shown to have hated the United States of America from the very start, witnessing US-backed Contras committing atrocities against his people. Sadly, the story does not get any better. In 1972, his family lost everything in a colossal earthquake, and a year later, a shelter that both Raul and his sister Josefina, whom he was close with, burned down, and his sister nearly died, being disfigured for life after the fact. Also, turns out the shelter was burnt down by its American owner on purpose to collect money from insurance fraud, something that would only further cement Raul's hatred for the United States. Afterwards, and likely the result of being left with nothing, Raul and his father Jose ran a cartel and sold drugs, but this only resulted in further personal tragedy as Jose was assassinated, sponsored by the CIA, causing Raul to hate the United States even more. After this, he doubled down by becoming a gun runner in Angola, backing the MPLA, being affiliated with the Soviets. And that's where we find Menendez at the start of this story chronologically. This is where our first encounter with Menendez happens from the perspective of Alex Mason, who, after rescuing his friend Frank Woods with Jason Hudson, encounters Menendez. Now, aside from the cartel business and gun running, the most prominent crime he commits in the beginning is torturing Frank Woods and his men, leaving Woods as the sole survivor, and is incredibly malnourished and dehydrated by the time Mason and Hudson find him. Raul, first and foremost, despite feeling his actions against the United States was justified, was still brutal. He relentlessly tortured Woods, psychologically trying to break him. And that goes far beyond revenge, especially since he had left him rotting with all of his men, leaving him as the only one alive. As Raul had a deep-seated hatred for the United States, Frank Woods would grow a deep-seated hatred for Menendez. The game really is a reflection on the cycle of violence. Raul Menendez didn't have to do what he did to Woods. His vendetta should have been against the leaders of the United States and anyone who committed grievous war crimes against his people, something which Woods didn't qualify for. Still, I imagine because he was an American and working for the US military, Menendez felt that he and his men deserved to be tortured beyond measure. And I think it's here where the big dilemma with Menendez comes in. Menendez might have standards from time to time, but he absolutely crossed the line here. Menendez may not have started this cycle of violence, but he perpetuated it onto Woods. Maybe if they were just enemies at war, that would have been the end of it, and one would have killed the other. But Menendez went out of his way to make Woods suffer, despite having no real personal reason to. Now, I'm not defending US involvement in Nicaragua, but this wasn't the result of the hardship of Menendez when it came to Woods. By this point, Menendez was back on his feet and wealthy. So what he did was a full-fledged choice, and I think that's what's important to note. When Menendez made Woods hate him, it, in hindsight, led to his greatest tragedy. Now, another thing I want to talk about is how Menendez is fearless in the face of death, as when Alex Mason has him at gunpoint, he smiles and destroys the radio Alex needed to call an evac, and in fact, pulls out a grenade that he just happened to have stuffed away in his pocket. Menendez, as we've seen, on top of being ruthless when dealing with his enemies, is a master tactician, and it's a trait that follows him all the way to the year 2025. Menendez was incredibly patient, waiting and planning for decades to destabilize the world. We can assume that the Black Ops timeline diverges from our own sometime after 2012, with the beginning of the rise of Menendez's group Cortes DA in 2014. I can imagine that Menendez realized that destabling capitalist nations was not something that could happen in a single day, and thus he worked for decades. He played the long game, and was rewarded, especially in the canon outcome of this game. Everything he did in the past and the future had a purpose. Eliminating Alex Mason and Jason Hudson was brutal but effective. But the way he did it was extra effective. He captured Hudson and threatened David Mason's life if he didn't comply. And he wasn't done after that. He conspired with Manuel Noriega to psychologically torment Woods after he had killed Alex Mason by his own hand, and made sure to cripple him after the fact. So both the emotional and physical pain set in. I noticed that watching Menendez right after Woods realizes he killed his best friend, he deliberately toys and goes out of his way to enrage Woods, both by crippling him and taunting him with the pistol that he tries to reach for, only to drag him down to his basement, and leaves both himself and Hudson with a sadistic choice. One of them must die, or else all three of them, including David, go. Hudson, who felt overwhelming guilt over being coerced to betray his friends, volunteers himself, and Menendez makes sure to make him suffer before he dies, as he shoots him in the kneecaps with a shotgun, making sure he feels it before he slits Hudson's throat and puts him out of his misery. In this scene, it can be gathered that in the 3 years since his sister died, he dedicated himself in the pursuit of revenge, and in the best way to exact revenge in the most painful way. I think he knew somewhat how his plan would go out to fruition. Knowing Woods is a soldier that would follow orders, and being ordered to kill Menendez, who he hated, was the perfect bait for him to kill Mason under the hood. Which is why I imagine Woods would have canonically gone for a headshot. He made sure that Woods would hate him extra more, but ensured there would be nothing he could do about it, because by crippling him in the legs and eliminating Hudson, he knew that he'd have to focus on taking care of David as his adopted nephew, more or less. The fact also that Woods didn't reveal to David the exact circumstances of his father's death until 36 years later, that he had killed his father, albeit unintentionally, must have really screwed Woods up mentally. I also imagine that Menendez, having the mole known as Salazar infiltrate David's team, was also able to keep tabs on how Woods was doing. And I imagine that learning that Woods was a complete screw-up with legs that no longer worked satisfied him. However, I don't think this satisfaction was enough, since in the bad ending where David decides to capture Menendez instead of executing him, he escapes from prison a year later and confronts Woods, pretty much pressuring him to apologize for his sister's death. Woods of course then denies Menendez what he wants, by pointing out where's his apology, indicating that he started it. He tortured and killed his men on purpose and drove him to kill his best friend. His sister's death was at the very least an accident. And so Menendez kills Woods and then goes to his sister's grave to burn himself. I imagine that no matter what, the only fulfillment Menendez could have found in his actions was in the seconds before David Mason executed him at the end of the game. He triggered a video to be uploaded onto the internet the second he was killed. Now, his sister may have been his reason to live, but I still think he to some degree appreciated the company of others. For example, his allies. He is affable to Fareed, for example, and is personally upset if Fareed reveals that he betrayed him, as if the player chooses to try and take down Menendez but fails, Menendez himself will tell him that he's working for a cause that thinks nothing of him before executing him. Menendez, by my assessment, was screwed up psychologically because of his tragic backstory. He was right to mourn the loss of his father and then his sister, but his reaction was far from healthy. He couldn't accept that death was a natural part of life, and he found himself incapable of finding someone else to love. I imagine if perhaps Menendez tried to find a wife and start a family, it would have calmed him down. However, I imagine the reason he never did so was because he was so consumed by the death of his sister that he rendered that option obsolete, because to him, what would be the point? Those he hated from the very beginning, the United States, were responsible for both his father and sister's deaths, and he probably thought he would not just be allowed to settle down and try again, because the United States would always show up and ruin his life. It didn't matter where he went anyways. He was known as a drug lord and gun runner, and the United States would go after him regardless. That is why I imagine he dedicated his life to Cordis Die, so that he could hopefully end the oppression once and for all, because at least his tragedies would mean something. I remember that line when he tells David the low sum an American insurance company placed on his sister. After his sister's death, it was a point of no return for Menendez and his personal happiness. But while this is an unfortunate descent into further villainy, I still want to point out that he still chose to do bad things of his own accord, like the torture of Woods and his men. It was a full choice he had that he acted on. As undeniably tragic as Menendez was, he still made many bad choices on his own accord, as by addition, the player can choose to execute Admiral Briggs as Menendez. And if Menendez chose to do so, it would make him a complete hypocrite, as Salazar personally asked him not to execute Briggs. But if Menendez does so, he merely retorts that he decides what deaths are necessary to achieve their goals. I don't think he would have killed David, because he needed to coerce Hudson, but I also think he knew that it would never have come to that, because he knew that Hudson would fold like a chair and give him what he wanted, an opportunity to kill Alex Mason and completely screw Woods in the head. I imagine that if Raul Menendez was able to push through his trauma and found a new reason to live, perhaps he could have reconciled with Woods. Woods does loosely hint at remorse towards David Mason when recalling the day he accidentally killed Josephina. But he's also overcome with anger, as he remembers that during that day, he so badly wanted to kill Menendez. That rage overcame him, and led to the death of an innocent life. Call of Duty Black Ops 2 is a critique more or less on the cycle of violence, and how both Woods and Menendez screwed each other over in the end. And David, at least canonically, led to the riots in Washington, D.C., with the White House being burned down, because he was overcome with revenge, and it just led to more violence. Raul Menendez is many things: tragic, cunning, manipulative, and he may have his redeeming qualities, but I think when it comes to his actions, the ones he made of his own accord, not out of pressure, not out of revenge or anything like that, he can still qualify as an understandable, but malicious, evil. Thank you for listening to this episode of Analyzing Evil. What do you think of Raul Menendez? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?